Good afternoon, doctors. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jazz Banga. I will be your host for this evening's program. I thank you all for joining me. Many of you are coming from all across the country, so I know our time zones might be a little bit different for each attendee, but I thought it'd be a good time at just about noon Eastern Standard to begin the program. So today we have a great topic on the transition plan for the practice. Can the dental office lease prevent your practice sale? And we will be discussing the lease agreement, provisions and clauses within it that either enable us to assign or transfer the lease or will act as a preventative measure when the time comes to assigning and exiting out of the practice. So again, my name is Jazz Banga. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group. I've been with the firm 3 going on for 4 years, really supporting the dental community as it relates to understanding the nuances within their lease agreement and helping them to structure better lease agreements to protect the practice, but also enable them to assign and sell the business. So in terms of the lease agreement, there are a number of items that we look to amend and address on behalf of our clients, which I'll be diving into as the program goes on. But before we get started, I thought it would be best to give you some background on our firm. I think it's important for all of you to understand our role in the dental community, our role in commercial real estate, and areas within the lease agreement in which we work and advise our clients on, given the lease makeup. So we are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm. We specifically specialize in advising dentists as it relates to commercial real estate matters. We were founded by a group of dentists back in 1994 as there was a gap as it relates to commercial real estate and the business of dentistry. For many of you that have started a practice, you will painfully understand the significant cost that you must incur to build out a dental practice from scratch. As such, the requirements from a dental tenant are much different than any other commercial tenant. On a per square footage basis, building and starting a dental practice is arguably the most expensive industry to enter into. So given that makeup, it certainly is recommended to have a dental specific advisor guide you through the negotiations of the lease, because as a dental tenant, we have much more to lose as it relates to the lease agreement and our practice base. Significant investment in leasehold improvements, significant time to pick up and move the dental practice in the event that we have to relocate the business. So certainly ensure that the lease is properly structured to facilitate your career plan, but also your transition plan. Since our inception back in 1994, we have represented over 10,000 dental and medical office tenants on their lease agreements, clients all over the country, to really make sure that they're properly equipped to protect their business. What's unique is the way that our firm is structured. We do have an in-house legal team as well as a leasing division in conjunction with our consulting team that all weigh in on the lease and real estate strategy to ensure that it fits the doctor's life plan, as opposed to your life plan revolving around the arbitrary document known as the lease agreement. So critical that we think of long-term planning, even if we're just starting the business. What we typically advise is in the last 5 to 10 years prior to transitioning, that the lease is properly set up to facilitate the sale and transfer of the lease. On an annual basis, we'll represent over 1,000 dental offices as it relates to the lease agreements all across North America. That includes Canada, but many of our clients are south of the border in the U.S. In addition to providing legal and real estate services for our clients, we also provide tremendous value to the dental community when it comes to educational programs. And as they say, knowledge is power, and the key here is being aware of the exact terms, conditions, and provisions within your lease agreement. As such, we provide over 100 CE accredited programs, whether that's a live lecture or a webinar like today's program. We certainly support the dental community when it comes to understanding the lease. In conjunction with our CE programs, we also lecture at many of the large dental conventions such as the Greater New York Dental Meeting, the Pacific Dental Conference, the Yankee Dental Conference, as well as the Hinman Conference in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as the CDA. We represent doctors nationwide and ensure that their best interests are taken at the forefront when it comes to negotiating the office lease agreement. So I thought it'd be great for you to understand some of the clients that we have represented nationwide all across the United States. And we have clients all the way from California to Washington State to New York City to the South and Florida, as well as Georgia and the Texas market. We're really well equipped to support guidance and counseling for clients all across the country. One great aspect of our leasing division, our in-house leasing team, we're able to provide a snapshot of the local marketplace all across the country. Really understand what the financials look like in a marketplace, what the average rental rates look like, but also understanding what dental-specific comps look like, what other dentists, competing dentists, are paying in your marketplace, which is critical to structuring an important and favorable financial arrangement with the landlord, not only today, but for the going future. Typically we advise our clients to structure a long-term deal, a 10-year deal with 2 5-year options. What that really does for you as a dental tenant is provides you long-term continuity and stability in the space, but also predictability in the future that your tenancy will remain intact and that the landlord cannot arbitrarily evict you from the space or force you into relocation, which is very detrimental to a dental practice. So did you know most dental tenants have signed a lease agreement with overly restrictive terms that may prevent them from ever selling their practice? I speak with a handful of doctors every week, and many of them will sign a lease agreement under their personal name, will structure a lease agreement that is unfavorable to their long-term standing as a tenant. And unfortunately, most dentists are first forced to learn this the hard way. And in many cases, it jeopardizes the sale of the clinic or devalues a practice. An improperly structured lease agreement does have broad implications on your ability to sell and transfer the lease. So the focus of today's program is to really narrow down and isolate particular provisions that will impact your particular ability to transition and exit out of your lease and assign the document to a prospective buyer. So what's the purpose of today's webinar? We have a number of items that we'll be addressing in today's program. First and foremost, we'll discuss the assignment clause. This provision has a direct impact on your ability to sell your practice. It is the language found within your lease that gives you or disallows you from ever transferring your lease. And in many cases, what we see is that the landlord has unconditional control and the right to deny their consent towards a transfer. So we'll certainly address some language found in the lease agreement to really inhibit the ability to sell and assign the lease. We'll also discuss personal guarantees and how to renegotiate personal guarantees to ensure that you're off the hook financially after you transition. And when I reference personal guarantees, which will be a common theme of today's program, I'm referring to signing a lease agreement through your personal name. Rather than signing the lease agreement as Dr. Jazz Banga LLC or through some form of a corporate entity, many doctors are signing the lease through their personal name, such as Dr. Jazz Banga. And what that does is it ensures that your lease agreement holds you particularly liable on a personal level. So your personal assets, your home, your car are all collateralized under the lease agreement, in addition to your savings, your investments. So critical that as we move forward in our career, as debt begins to diminish and our asset base continues to grow, critical that we separate our personal attachment to the lease agreement, particularly when we're in that last phase of our career where we're evaluating the eventual sale of the business. We'll also discuss how to structure your lease to increase flexibility and minimize landlord interference at the sale time. So ensure that the lease is properly set up to allow a clear and very transparent transition from one party to the next, from seller to buyer. And then we'll also discuss some items in the lease agreement that can impact your eventual exit. The surrender of premises, which references the status in which we need to leave the space at the end of the term in the event we hand the keys back to the landlord. Very often we find in lease agreements that the tenant is responsible to restore the space back to vanilla shell. For an average tenant, a bookstore, a nail salon, a restaurant, or even an accounting or law firm, very easy to restore the space back to original condition. Not the case with a dental office. Given the significant investment into leasehold improvements, we see an exorbitant cost at the end of the term in the event the landlord requires you to restore it back to original shell. There's items related to restoring plumbing, electrical, removing any dental-specific fixtures, such as cabinetry, and really capping and breaking down the dental practice, which is a very expensive process at the end of the term. And lastly, we'll discuss how to set up your lease to appeal for future job buyers. How can we make your practice lease attractive to a potential buyer and ensure that they do not run away from the deal given some terms and conditions that can impact their tenancy when they acquire your business? The first question I like to ask at many of my seminars, live or during the webinar, is what is a lease agreement? What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of a lease agreement? And many times the answer I get is it is a legal agreement, it is a drafted agreement between landlord and tenant. But really, on the surface, what a dental lease is, it is really a check. It is arguably the biggest check that you will sign in your entire career. And I'd like to repeat that. The dental lease agreement is arguably the largest check that you will ever sign in your entire career. I'll give you a great example. The average dental practice is about 2,000 square feet. Based on that, we often see, just speaking very openly, average rent for a 2,000 square feet, not market specific, just on an open basis all across the country, that rent rates are roughly $5,000 per month for a 2,000 square feet suite. If we look at that on an annualized basis, we're looking at a $60,000 rent obligation. Now, the average dental career spans for about 30 years, where we are a practicing and licensed dentist, we have our patients, we are in our given location for a number of years, typically about 30. So based on the $60,000 per year, if we're looking at a 10-year career, that is $600,000. Over a 30-year span, we're looking at a $1.8 million obligation in rent to the landlord to maintain our tenancy as a dental tenant. When you initially signed your lease agreement, I'm fairly certain that no one had ever advised you that the lease agreement was a multi-million-dollar contract. You were about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract. Had you known at the beginning of your career that this was a significant investment that you're about to make in the form of rent, I'm fairly certain that we would have spent more due diligence on determining the exact contractual relationship between landlord and tenant and ensure that the lease agreement was properly structured and set up. So part of today's focus is, number one, focusing on the lease agreement, but also understanding how we can have the lease agreement work in our favor and ensure that when we are ready to exit and hang up our dental coat, that we're able to do so and the lease is properly structured for the eventual transition. So what should your lease do for you? The lease should do a number of things for you as a dental tenant. First and foremost, it should enhance your ability to sell your practice. Ensure that the lease is properly set up vis-a-vis the assignment provision to have a straightforward process when we identify a prospective buyer to acquire a business and go through the motions of assigning the lease agreement. We also want to ensure that the lease provides fair and affordable financial terms, that rents are based on fair market value, that rent escalations are in line with the market, are in line with CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and that going forward at each auction period, we are given the ability, the legal right to renegotiate rental rates based on current market conditions. We will also look to structure in the lease agreement a long-term stability and security for the space. And when I reference long-term stability and security, that is conducted simply by having a well-drafted term of the lease. So I mentioned earlier that on average, we negotiate on behalf of our clients a 10-year deal with 2 5-year options. There's continuity and predictability that you will be in the space for a minimum of 20 years based on fair market value and that the lease is properly structured. And lastly, the lease should minimize your risk and exposures. Ensure that the lease agreement is signed through some form of a corporate entity or that there's a mechanism built into the lease to assign the lease to your own corporate entity so long as you fulfill certain duties of the lease within the initial period or term of the agreement. We also want to minimize exposures, personal as well as those to our state, by structuring a death and disability provision, which allows you as a dental tenant to terminate the lease agreement in the event of a disability, but also your estate to acquire the lease agreement, have the ability to transfer the lease and derive value, even if you're unable to produce, whether that's by death or disability, and that there is termination rights for your estate in the event they're unable to find a prospective buyer to acquire your business. So certainly lots to cover off in our short hour, and we have about 45 minutes left, so I'll look to get through the program fairly quickly and cover as many topics as quickly as possible, but also give you guys some time at the end of the program to ask any questions relevant to your specific lease arrangement. And lastly, we want to ensure that we can maximize your flexibility, ensure that there's transferability of the lease, that there's future options and term on the lease agreement, and that the lease is predictable going forward. So as the focus of today's program is on the transferability of the lease and preparing the practice for sale, I think it's important to understand what are the 3 sellable and key items and components of the lease agreement when we are going through the appraisal of your business. The first item that gets appraised under the lease agreement is the equipment. We look at the depreciated value of the equipment. Is the practice modern? Is it up to current standards? Are we on digital systems? Or is the practice paperless? I always encourage doctors when they're evaluating their last 10-year plan of their career to invest into new equipment and technology, because not only will they derive value on the sale from new equipment and technology and recuperate the investment they make, but they also increase their buyer pool because, as you can imagine, a dental tenant or a dental associate that is looking to acquire a business would like to have a modern state-of-the-art practice as opposed to a dated practice. So critical that we invest into new equipment and technology to make sure that the practice is up to par with the current market landscape. The next item that we look at is goodwill. And this is a term that's loosely used in the medical industry as to, what does goodwill really mean? And when we think of goodwill, we simply think of revenue. What it truly is the revenue that is derived per patient on an annual basis. And typically, when we appraise a practice, the goodwill is measured on the last 3 years of revenue, and the last year being the critical item. Many doctors I speak with in the last 3 or 4 years of their practice career, they begin to reduce their time in the practice, production goes down, which will have an impact on the overall appraised value of the business. I always encourage clients to have a strong finish to their career so they can maximize the value of the business and derive a true value of what their practice is worth. And lastly, we look at the lease agreement. The terms, the conditions, are there any liabilities built into the lease agreement that will prevent the future tenant from maintaining their tenancy, any risk and traps within that agreement, as well as the rental rates and understanding how they relate to the marketplace. Because if the lease agreement in terms of rent is overvalued, it will impact the purchase and sale agreement, and typically the overcharges in rent in relation to market value will be offsetted in the sale price. So again, we need to ensure that the lease agreement is in line with the current market conditions and that we are properly set up to assign and transfer the lease. So what's in your lease agreement? The first provision that I'd like to discuss, and given the topic today is on transition, I will give you all a few moments just to read this and go over it and identify any potential traps and risks. And the assignment language is the process which occurs when we identify a prospective buyer and go through the motions of transferring the lease to that buyer. So typically what happens is we first get the practice appraised vis-a-vis goodwill, depreciated value of equipment, and valuating the lease agreement. And secondarily, we will look at what the assignment language looks like. So in accordance with this particular lease, we see some key concerns and issues. If the tenant should wish to assign or sublet this lease, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord, which is fairly common that the landlord needs to be apprised of the party that's coming in and will be the guardian as to whether that consent is granted or not. However, as it's stating in this particular provision, which again is found in 75% of office lease agreements, there is no language that prevents the landlord from unreasonably withholding consent. The landlord has unconditional control over the transfer of this lease, given they are the sole notifier of providing that consent. So any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days following the receipt by landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option. So we have identified a buyer, we've negotiated a purchase and sale agreement, and then we submit our request to the landlord to obtain their consent. And in accordance with this particular provision, the landlord has 3 avenues that they can go down. Number 1 is approve tenant's request to sign the lease or sublet the premises. Great. The landlord says, great news, this buyer is qualified, we will grant you permission and all is well. However, we often see that the second condition can be quite detrimental. Decline tenant's request to sign lease or sublet premises, which means the landlord can basically hold off and prevent us from ever selling the business by having that unconditional control. And lastly, the landlord has the right to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease or sublet. So by notifying the landlord in accordance with this particular provision, the landlord can simply terminate our tenancy and recapture the space by us simply requesting to the landlord to transfer the lease agreement. As you can imagine, this is quite detrimental as the sale of our business really does fund our transition and our retirement plan. So critical that we amend this particular provision to ensure that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold consent and cannot condition or delay their consent. Additionally, should the landlord consent to an assignment or sublet of the premises, landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of then market rent for the leased premises or 15% greater than the current market rent. Great. If we want to get the landlord to take on our prospective buyer as a new tenant for the space, which only occurs when we're ready to sell the business, the landlord can agree to it, but can revise the rent and increase the rental rate, which will have an impact on our ability to sell. When we get the practice appraised, the value of the lease is involved in the appraised value. But in accordance with the assignment language, if the landlord is able to increase rent by 15% or more, that will have an impact on the profit and loss statement of the lease agreement going forward. Therefore, the buyer can reduce or minimize or take off a certain percentage off the sale value of the business and lower the value in which they acquire the business, given the impact of an increase of rent for their tenancy. Furthermore, should tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of this lease or sublet of the premises that is over and above the current base rental rate payable to landlord at any fiscal year during the term of the lease, the difference between the annual rent and such rental income, cash goods, or other consideration shall be paid to landlord directly within 30 days of receipt. So what this provision is essentially stating is when we assign the lease agreement and go through the motions, the landlord is entitled to any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of the lease. The landlord must be apprised of the details of the transfer, which means they will be aware of the exact transaction cost. So hypothetically, if we sell the business for $1 million, we do need to notify the landlord that the practice is selling for $1 million. And as this provision states, the landlord is entitled to any form of consideration, which means that the landlord is entitled to the proceeds of sale. You can imagine at the end of your career when you're ready to sell the business, to give the landlord a percentage of the sale of the value of the business is astronomical and very scary as a dentist when we have our transition and retirement plan predicated on the value which we believe our practice is worth. How this lease is structured, the landlord is entitled to a percentage of those proceeds of sale. What we often see is landlords putting us in a position where essentially our transfer of the lease and sale of the business is contingent on us providing them with a certain percentage. The last thing we ever want to do is give the landlord a percentage of the sale of our business, but in accordance with this document, we are essentially forced to do so in order to transfer or sell the business. I was working with a doctor not too long ago whose lease agreement was structured in a similar fashion. And the doctor was 65 years old, ready to exit out of the business. His associate was ready to acquire the practice, and the landlord requested 20% of the $1 million valuation to proceed with a transfer. Otherwise, they would deny their consent, and the tenant would have to remain as a tenant in the property. Very dangerous for that doctor. And in the end, he settled for a $200,000 cash payment to the landlord to receive his $800,000 in practice sale. So we certainly want to have this conversation and understand what our assignment and subletting provision looks like in advance of the sale. Typically 5 to 10 years prior to our transition or planned transition, to understand what the assignment language looks like and ensure that the landlord cannot condition, delay, or add certain aspects such as pre-approval for financing, for items like termination on the lease agreement, which will be detrimental to the eventual sale of our business. The last item of merit here, which I often find in about 90% of lease agreements, is considered ongoing liability. Notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under this lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. What does that mean? What that means is when we sell our business, we will remain jointly and severally liable with the prospective buyer for the remainder of the term of the lease. What's interesting here is if we ever plan on selling our practice for north of $500,000, the lead banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, Affinity Bank, PNC, the banks require a minimum of 5 and in some cases 10 years of guaranteed term for the buyer going forward. They do this so that they can amortize the loan and spread it over the additional term. The challenge with that is when we exercise further options for the future to facilitate the sale for our buyer, we would also be reliable for that additional period of time. The way in which we want to structure the lease agreement is that there is liability termination for the seller upon sale or transfer of the lease. That the assignee, i.e. the dentist that currently owns the practice, will no longer remain liable upon transfer of the lease. In the event the landlord would like the assignee to remain or have some form of liability attached to the lease agreement, there are other creative ways in which we can diminish our liability, such as capping that liability to 1 year's worth of rent or having a burnout rate on the liability. So long as the buyer fulfills the duties of the lease for a period of 2 to 3 years, our liability will diminish 20 to 30% year over year until we have zero liability with the lease agreement. I was working on a case in Chicago, Illinois quite recently where a doctor sold his practice to his associate. The associate acquired the business, bought the business for $1.4 million, took on a considerable amount of debt when he acquired the business, but also simultaneously bought a brand new home, bought a brand new car, in addition to buying the practice. Within 2 years, drove the practice down into the ground, was a poor business manager, and defaulted on the lease agreement. He was unable to fulfill the duties of the lease and pay his rent on time. As such, the landlord terminated the lease agreement in which the tenant, the associate, claimed bankruptcy, went insolvent, in which the landlord was unable to recuperate damage from the associate or brand new dentist that was in the practice. Immediately upon termination of the lease and notifying of the bankruptcy of the doctor, the landlord then went after the seller. He went after the seller for the remainder 8 years of term of the lease agreement to the tune of $350,000 in undue rent. Unfortunately, the doctor was in a unique predicament whereby he was retired, was enjoying his retirement plan, and was out of the practice, but he was hit by this notification from the landlord that he owed a considerable amount in undue rent from the failure of the doctor he sold the business to. So as such, we certainly want to ensure going forward that the assignment and subletting provision will allow us to transfer the lease, will provide us the flexibility to do so, but will also mitigate our exposure and continual liability following the sale. So as you can see here, the assignment provision found in this particular example is riddled with key concerns and items that absolutely need to be addressed prior to evaluating a sale of the business. The next item of merit to discuss is personal guarantees, and this is found in 90% of lease agreements. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, for those of you that have tuned in late, just to bring you up to speed, a personal guarantee is when we sign the lease agreement through our personal name, rather than through some form of a corporate entity, an LLC, a PC, an S Corp, or whatever the corporate entity may be. Most doctors, unbeknownst to them, sign through their personal name, which means that their personal assets, their estate, those of their beneficiaries, as well as their investments, their car, their home, are collateralized under the lease agreement. So in the event that the tenant or the doctor in question is unable to fulfill the duties of the lease agreement, the landlord will have the right to come after their personal assets to recuperate damages. As an inducement to the landlord to accept this lease, the tenant hereby agrees with the landlord that the tenant and guarantor shall be unconditionally bound to the landlord for their performance of all obligations of tenant under this lease for the initial term and any options to renew. So great, we've signed the lease agreement at the beginning of our career. We've signed a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. In accordance with this lease agreement, the tenant will be liable for not only the initial 10 years, but also the 2 additional 5-year options. As we move through our career plan and as we begin to reduce debt and increase our asset base, critical that we separate our personal assets from our professional assets. I encourage you, for those of you that aren't incorporated today, please do so. Structure the lease through your corporate entity. Establish a veil of protection for your personal assets and protect your family, your estate going forward. The tenant guarantee and save harmless landlord against all liabilities, damages, claims, fines, penalties, costs, and other expenses. The tenant hereby covenants that following the execution and delivery of the landlord standard for lease, the execution of the guarantor form. So we often see that doctors will sign the lease. You know, they may be lucky and sign the lease through their corporate entity, but the landlord will have them sign another guarantee agreement that is often found as an exhibit or an addendum or a rider at the back of the lease agreement, which means even though they sign personally through their corporate entity, that they would still have a personal attachment to the lease. let's establish ways where we can mitigate that personal attachment as time goes on, or cap that personal value to what our liability will look like. But again, ideally have this conversation early and often, whether that's at the renewal of the lease agreement or at the initial onset of the lease. We certainly want to have a discussion with the landlord as it relates to our personal attachment to the lease. So did you know most commercial tenants included, have agreed to provide their landlords with unconditional personal guarantees, thus exposing their family and estate to unnecessary risk. This is particularly important as we move through the motions of our latter stages of our career plan. Again, let's begin to incorporate mechanisms of removing any personal liability and having our corporate entity structured under the lease agreement to protect us and our family. The third item to discuss is surrender of premises, the status and condition in which we have to leave the space at the end of our career. Many dentists are forced to incur the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars in demo and construction costs when the time comes to exit their practice, as per the surrender clause in their dental office lease. What that means is, at the end of our career, if we decide to give the keys back to the landlord, in many lease agreements, we see language which ensures that the tenant that is exiting the space or handing the keys back must restore the space back to original shell. You know, as a law firm, how we operate, very easy for us to do so. We take out our tables and chairs, we unplug our computers, and we leave the space. For a dental office, it is considerable cost of removing any plumbing, any electrical, any drywall, carpentry, any tiles, and even demised walls separating operatories. Let's ensure that going forward that the surrender clause is properly drafted, which will ensure that we do not need to restore the space back and we can simply hand the keys back in broom-swept condition. But this is more in particular relevant when we assign the lease agreement to a prospective buyer. What we often see is the prospective buyer would inherit this restoration liability, which means that they would lowball the offer on the practice anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000 because they will inherit this surrender liability and may be at risk at the end of the term to restore the space back. There needs to be clarity on the matter, and we need to do that early. Ensure that at the end of our career that we do not have to restore the space back, which is a very costly expense to occur when we're ready to exit the business of dentistry. So when we're evaluating lease agreements, there are a number of lease provisions and clauses that we look to evaluate. In the interest of today's program, and given that is a 1-hour lecture, we were only able to cover off a few items such as the assignment language, personal guarantees, as well as the surrender provision. Again, ensure that the lease is assignable, minimize any controls that the landlord will have to prevent them from consenting to a transfer of the lease agreement. Let's ensure that our liability is removed upon sale or mitigated upon sale, and that it is a smooth and straightforward process to assign the lease agreement to a dentist in particular. And landlords should be happy that you're selling the business to another dentist, because you have been in the space for 30 years. Once you assign the lease agreement, the prospective buyer will be in the space and provide the landlord with predictable rent and income for many years to come going forward. So key items, and when we review a lease agreement, we cover all these key terms and provisions within your office lease agreement to understand how that total arrangement looks like and to ensure that you're well equipped and prepared to transfer and that the landlord is not involved in preventing you from assigning and transferring the lease. So again, I encourage all of you to take a keen look at this slide, because it is critical to understand how each and every term and condition here will impact your tenancy today, but also in the near future. So how do we win the negotiations? You know, there are some key items and concerns within the lease agreement that absolutely need to be addressed prior to ever assigning the lease. However, it is critical to understand the timelines involved when renewing or going through the motions of assigning the lease. It is critical from a leverage standpoint to begin the process 24 months prior to expiration. And there's a number of reasons for that, but first and foremost, it will allow you to have the flexibility to continue to evaluate what your current lease arrangement looks like. And if we're not happy with the current lease agreement, timing is key to identify what the current market looks like, see what availabilities look like in the area, in the interest of ever relocating the business. It is also a leverage card to be played with the landlord to tell them and advise them that, hey, yes, we want to be a tenant in this property, but we're also evaluating the marketplace. And this is a card that can only be pulled 18 to 24 months prior to expiration. Starting the process early allows you to have the flexibility to evaluate multiple options, but will also allow you to have a conversation with the landlord as it relates to renewing and amending the lease agreement without being forced into a corner, having to artificially renew the lease given the time constraints. So as you can see here, the further and further we get closer to the expiration date, the lower and lower our negotiation leverage is. Landlords are aware of the timeline it takes to rebuild and relocate a dental practice. And one thing I was taught very early on in my previous life as a landlord representative for healthcare tenants is that landlords love to delay the process as much as possible. They will delay, ignore calls, and look to have you and force you into a conversation where you have no other option but to renew the lease on their terms and conditions. In order to have a successful negotiation, I absolutely encourage you to understand when the expiration date is, but also the option to renew deadline. The option to renew deadline is typically found 90, 120, or 365 days prior to expiration, whereby we need to notify the landlords of whether our intentions are to stay or to assign the lease or renew the lease or exit out of the lease and walk away from the business. Critical going forward that we begin that conversation early and often. Just want to be certain that all of you are aware of key items, your expiration date and your option to renew deadlines, because that will have an impact on your ability to have a strong-winded negotiation. So what are strategies and tactics for winning the lease negotiation? Since being in business since 1994, we've developed a very stringent process on how we approach the lease negotiations, which I'm happy to share with you all today. Again, first and foremost, begin the process early, 24 months in advance of expiration. We would also look to gather all documentation. So understand what arrangements are already in place, the original lease agreement, any extensions, modifications, riders, addendums, any items related to your tenancy, we certainly want to collect and review on your behalf. I would like to give you all a bit of practical advice today. Many doctors I speak with have one copy of their lease agreement, a hard copy that's buried on the bottom drawer of their admin's office. Absolutely encourage all of you to have multiple copies of your lease arrangement on hand, not only in a physical copy, but also in a digital form. Save your lease agreement. Have one on your email, have one in the cloud, keep one on a USB drive, and also have a hard copy that is accessible. The last thing we ever want to do with any negotiation prior to commencing is request documents from the landlord. That certainly puts us at a leverage disadvantage if that ever occurs. So please do have copies of your lease, keep them on hand, and also ensure you have multiple copies. Secondarily, in our process is that we will identify your practice and career goals. How long do you plan on practicing? Are there expansion ambitions? Are there ambitions to open up a secondary or third office? Really understand what your career trajectory will look like and understand how long you plan on practicing to ensure that the lease is properly set up to meet whatever your career goals are. Once we obtain a copy of the lease and we understand your career goals, we will go through the formal review of the document. Spend 3 to 4 hours evaluating all the key terms, conditions, and provisions of the lease agreement and provide you with a red line or a highlight document of all the risks and traps involved in that agreement so that we're aware of the exact contractual obligation that we are with the landlord and areas that we're looking to improve the lease arrangement with the landlord. The fourth step in the process is to prepare with market research. Our in-house leasing division will be able to pull up a report anywhere in the country of average rental rates, market rental rates, last renewed tenants in the property, vacancies and availabilities, so that we have a strong understanding of what the current market conditions look like, but also are apprised of who the landlord is, have we had past dealings with them, are they competent and willing enough to negotiate favorable terms and conditions with our clients. But that is only done by spending a number of hours in preparing with market research and understanding the landscape. Once we've developed the market research and provided terms and conditions as to the rental rates in the area, we will then set up a conversation understanding the outcome and strategy development plan. What are we looking to achieve? How are we going to achieve that? Going through a red line and commentary of the lease document and making sure that you are on page and on the same understanding as to what we're looking to achieve with the lease agreement and the renewal of that document. What we haven't done up until the stage 5 is done one thing, picked up the phone and notified the landlord. From section 1 through 5 is what I call due diligence. And in terms of understanding due diligence, we certainly want to understand what the market looks like, understand the terms and conditions of the lease, leveraging particular aspects of the lease to obtain some of the big tick items. The key items that we're really looking to achieve in any lease negotiation is minimize your personal exposure, ensure that the lease is assignable, reduce any personal liabilities, and ensure that the lease is well drafted to allow you to transfer and assign the lease and eventually walk away from the business. Once we've determined the goals and objectives and developed a strategy, at that point we would pick up the phone and call the landlord. We have all the data to support our arguments, we have understanding the market landscape, as well as we're approaching the landlord on the interest of signing a long-term lease arrangement. A 10-year deal with 2 5-year options, which landlords are head over heels to establish. Have a qualified tenant lock in for 10 years with 2 5-year options, all is well with the landlord if that is the case. So step 6 is we look to negotiate the rental rates and the financials of the agreement. Determine what fair market value is, capture all negotiations as it relates to the financials on paper. Ensure that the numbers that we negotiate with the landlord are binding going forward. Once we have negotiated the financials, which is anywhere from an 18-hour to 20-hour process, to really go back and forth and have a dialogue with the landlord as it relates to fair market conditions. And this is all done in terms of our understanding of fair market value based on some great reports that we have access to in-house. We license some great software which really allows us to pinpoint anywhere in the country what rent rates look like and what current tenants have negotiated in their properties. Now that we've negotiated the financials, we would then move on to understanding and negotiating the legal and financial terms of the agreement. So now that the landlord has agreed to certain financials going forward, they would be motivated to consummate a deal, a long-term deal with you as a tenant, but we certainly need to do so on conditions that are favorable towards both parties. That we have clear language in here as to our status as a tenant going forward, how the terms and conditions impact our liability, and mitigating our risk and exposures through a strong negotiation of the legal terms of the lease agreement. So, but any negotiation is twofold. We have our financial arrangement and we have our legal arrangement. In my opinion, the legal standing of the lease agreement is of the utmost importance, because if, for example, we are forced into a relocation or arbitrarily evicted based on some standards in the lease agreement, then we're in a position not to derive full value from the business, and it can be really detrimental to the sale. Lastly, Once we've agreed to financials, we've agreed to terms and conditions, we do a final review and execution of the lease. So we do a final fine-tooth comb rove of the entire agreement to ensure that it is consistent with the terms and conditions that we previously negotiated with the landlord in past dealings. Unbelievable to see when we have spent anywhere from 3, 6, or 9 months negotiating a deal and get to the final iteration of the lease agreement, and the landlord pulls a bait and switch. That the last few months of negotiation were obsolete because the landlord has now moved to a different lease agreement. And has terms and conditions that we had amended and formally agreed upon structured into the agreement that we are about to sign. So we want to ensure in the final step that whatever you're signing is in line with what we have been negotiating in the past. So critical for the success of a practice to really understand and follow a process. Do your due diligence well in advance of appraising the business or renewing your lease or planning for a transition and sale of the business. Gather all documents, have multiple copies of that lease agreement, understand the career goals and what your career trajectory looks like, develop a plan based on market research and understanding the terms and conditions of the lease, and then getting in touch with the landlord once we are well established and equipped to have a strong negotiation with the landlord. So part of today's program, given our core sponsorship from one of the dental community partners, we are providing some great value for our clients today, or for all of you in attendance for today's webinar. We're going to be providing you a complimentary review of your lease agreement. We'll evaluate the critical dates and do a risk analysis and audit of your lease agreement. Understand what the current market landscape looks like as it relates to rental rates in the area, reviewing the lease agreement and identifying any potential risks and traps that can impact your current tenancy or alternatively impact you after the sale of the business. We will then schedule a call to go over your vision and plan, determine and uncover the traps, structure out exactly and provide you guidance on what the ideal lease agreement should look like, and provide you a plan of how to negotiate effectively and tactically to get a win when it comes to the negotiations of the lease agreement. So for those of you that are interested in signing up for the complimentary lease review, it is a promotion that will be on a first-come, first basis. I do have a limit of 5 lease reviews that I'm able to offer for today's program. For those of you interested, please do reach out to me immediately via email. Happy to set up the conversation to review your lease. Essentially how the process unfolds is you would send over the executed copy of the lease agreement along with any ancillary documents. Once I receive those agreements, I will then spend some time with my leasing division to understand what the market conditions look like. Once we've established that, we will spend 3 to 4 hours reviewing the lease agreement and then coordinate a call with you to go over our findings and develop a preferred alternative path. So again, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar on transition and assignment of the lease agreement. I know we spoke at great length and covered many topics very quickly, but I'm here as a resource for you. Please do email me if you do have interest in the review of the lease agreement. Again, it's at a first-come, first-served basis. So for those of you that are interested in reviewing or setting up and coordinating a complimentary review, absolutely able to do so. The $1,500 fee has been waived by our corporate partners, so there will be no surprise for you if you do sign up for the service. But it's a great value to understand exactly the arrangement you have with the landlord and developing a plan for the renewal or transition to ensure that we get full maximum value of our tenancy. So I'm going to move on to the poll. If anybody has any questions or concerns with the lease, I'd like to set up a little bit of a Q&A. So for those of you that are interested, I'm going to move to the Q&A portion of the program. Please feel free to shoot me an email if you have any particular questions that you would like me to address on a one-to-one basis. Otherwise, given the large group that we have in today's webinar, I thought it'd be best to have you all join me in a Q&A regarding the lease agreement. So as such, just wanted to go back to the meeting and really understand some key items here. Going forward, for those of you that are interested in the lease review, you do not need to fill out the voucher itself. All I require on my end is a copy of your lease agreement, which you can either email or fax to me, and I will review that document, spend a considerable amount of time reviewing that on your behalf, as well as giving you an understanding of what fair market value looks like in your practice area, so that we can have a strong negotiation prior to the transfer of your lease. So I'll move forward into the polling portion of the program today. So for those of you that have any questions regarding, setting up a lease review, there's questions here regarding receiving CE credits. So I do encourage you to join me in the poll, and happy to coordinate a call. My legal and leasing team will be involved in terms of reviewing the lease agreements for you. And, again, happy to set up a call in the coming days. My email is jbanga@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. Again, it is on a first-come, first-served basis with a limit of 5. We do have a large group here, so I certainly encourage you to join me and shoot me an email to set up a conversation regarding your particular lease arrangement. So again, thank you all for joining me today. My name is Jazz Banga. It was a pleasure having you guys join me on today's webinar. Please feel free to send me an email or send over a copy of the lease agreement for my review, and we can set up a call. CE credits will be delivered following the program. I just need you to fill into the poll. And again, thank you all for joining me. Have a great day, and we look forward to speaking with you to advise you with the review of your lease agreement. Thank you all. Take care and have a great day.